Okay, let's pick up at the end of Second Corinthians chapter 7. 2 Corinthians chapter 7. 2 Corinthians 7 is a pivotal chapter because it gives us a good glimpse into the reaction of First Corinthians. Remember, Paul had written First Corinthians um, in a scathing rebuke. You could just make a list. Almost every time you turn the page in First Corinthians, there's another problem in the church there, and Paul just excoriates them for their misbehavior and their misunderstandings. And he would say in chapter 7 that as soon as I sent that letter, he says, I regretted it, but not really regretting it. He just, so the idea here is whether he was fearful in how they would respond. And so he tells us that he was anxious about the report. And then finally, Titus comes. At some point, he had sent Titus down there to gauge their reaction, and Titus comes back and he says, we were doubly comforted. Number one is it's always good to see Titus. But more importantly, that Titus brought us a positive report that you had, he uses the word, you cleared yourself in this matter, and you'd had zeal and repentance in regard to that. We looked at this, but I want to back up just a little bit. In chapter 7, verse 12, we're not really sure what to make of who's being talked about. He says, although, 2 Corinthians 7, verse 12, therefore, although I wrote to you, I did not do it for the sake of him who did the wrong, nor for the sake of him who suffered wrong, but that our care for you in the sight of God might appear to you. And so the obvious question are, who are the two hymns in verse 12? Him who did the wrong and him who suffered the wrong. Now, there's a few possibilities, um, or really a few million possibilities, but a few that we'll consider here. One is that he is referring to something in First Corinthians. And if we look in First Corinthians, the only couple things that we can think of that are kind of singled out, much of the problems seem to be group problems. And so you would say them and not him. But there's a couple hymns, possible hymns in First Corinthians. One would be, it will go in reverse order, would be in chapter 6, they were lawsuits. And so is it possible that there were two men who were involved in the lawsuit? And Paul is referring to those two, him who had initiated it and him who had been wrong. That's one possibility. The other possibility that many would point to would be really in First Corinthians 5. The him there would be the fornicator, uh, the adulterer who had his father's wife. And some would argue that the him was the adulterer, the fornicator, and the one who was offended was his father. If his father was still alive, we don't know that for sure. But so that's a possibility that that's the two parties there. Another possibility that is raised is that there was some offender at Corinth, and the one who was wronged was Paul himself. And so Paul is saying, somebody there wronged me. And so there's a couple possibilities. Um, remember, uh, our old adage, though, when we're reading these letters, we're reading like grandma's letters in the attic. They would have known, I would assume, instantly who he's talking about. We're at a bit of a disadvantage in knowing the particulars of that case. Here's another possibility: is that he is using it as kind of as a literary device. He doesn't have a particular person or persons in mind. He's just using a kind of a vague concept. The one that was wronged and the one who did the wrong. Whether it not necessarily meant to be singular, could be plural, could be talking about this, that. And so he's saying, you did wrong, you've wronged others. And so it's just more of it would be a vague statement about that. The end result is we just simply do not know about this. Now, we said this in the introduction, I think, of both First Corinthians, but we again, we're at a disadvantage of not knowing the particulars. But let's add this: we don't need to know the particulars. Those people have been dead for a long time, and there's nothing we can do about their situation. What this is recorded for and preserved for us is so that we can gain some knowledge, and we don't have to have the names to be able to apply the principles there. But I want to raise this that many, in fact, I would probably argue in my limited research that a majority of biblical New Testament scholars would argue that we have First and Second Corinthians, but many would argue that there were at least 4 letters that Paul wrote to the church at Corinth. We only have 2 of them. It gets far more convoluted than that. Some would argue that there's 6 to 8 letters that were written. But here's kind of the quick survey of of where they got there. In First Corinthians, remember he says there in First Corinthians chapter 5, I wrote to you not to keep company. And some are arguing that he had wrote to them in a previous letter. And so there's a pre-First Corinthians where he had already talked about that situation. And now First Corinthians, which is really the second letter, is kind of a follow-up to that. I don't see that. I think that there's again a literary use there where he says I wrote to you, and he's talking about what he's writing here. And then some would argue that then we have this pre-letter, then we have First Corinthians, and then we have another letter back up in chapter 7, verse 8. He says, "For even if I made you sorry with my letter," some would argue that that's the third letter, not Second Corinthians, that he'd written some other letter in between there that he's being talked about. And I think their argument is very convoluted. It's simply that Paul wouldn't regret or even use the word regret of writing an inspired letter, or that he wouldn't have shed tears. And I'm just like, no, First Corinthians fits all of those. And so, but anyway, I just wanted to share that with you because in your reading, you might read some things about that. But it seems to me that the evidence is very sketchy. That no sense to me to say anything other than they were just 2 letters. And some would even argue that there was a visit. Paul went and visited them between First and Second Corinthians and made a personal visit. And so it gets very convoluted. But I just want to share that with you. All right, now chapter 7, verse 13 says, "Therefore we have been comforted in your comfort, and we rejoiced exceedingly more for the joy of Titus, because his spirit has been refreshed by you all." And so, overwhelmingly, it was good news, the response to that first letter. "For if anything, I have boasted to him about you, I am not ashamed." In other words, so Paul apparently had told Titus, hey, these are good people. They're going to make this right. And maybe a little bit of, oh, am I going to have egg on my face because I said they were good people? And Titus is going to come back and say, no, those people are terrible. What are you talking about, Paul? And he said, no, that you've kind of confirmed my feelings about you. Verse 14 again, "But as we spoke all things to you in truth, even so our boasting to Titus was found true. And his affections are greater for you as he remembers the obedience of you all, how with fear and trembling you received him. Therefore I rejoice that I have confidence in you in everything." So let's not make too much of Paul's corrective language in Second Corinthians. There's still things that need to be addressed, but we would emphasize the things that he addresses in Second Corinthians that were wrong at Corinth are not the things in First Corinthians. He doesn't say, I told you to get that Lord's Supper stuff straightened out, and you didn't. I told you about the fornicator. I told you about I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am Cephas. None of those, they seem to all fix all of that. But now there's a new problem, or maybe not new, but another problem that is out there that he's dealing with in Second Corinthians, and namely that's these detractors. They were, again, I would argue, a minority who had come into the church and were now disparaging Paul and his message. And Paul will have two things to say about that. Number one is those guys need to shut up. They're wrong. And the second thing is the rest of you should have dealt with this. Kind of shame on you for me having to do this, to come to my own defense. You knew better than this. You know the truth. You should have shut this down before I had to address it. And so that, but when we're going to talk about those things, already have and will, but don't let that erase what he's saying here in chapter 7. He just says, I'm so proud of you that you've made these corrections of the things in 1 Corinthians. All right, so now we're going to kind of turn the corner in chapter 8, verse 1. He says, moreover, we talk a lot about that word therefore that we see in Scripture that causes us to say this is attached to what I've just said. It seems to me that moreover is kind of almost the opposite of therefore. Moreover, here's another thing not related to that. And so, moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia. It's our belief that Paul wrote this letter from Macedonia. And so he's talking about those churches that are there, that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. I think Paul intentionally uses almost contradictory words there to make the point. He says that out of their poverty, not just poverty, but deep poverty. And let's talk just a little bit about that. The Greek language in which the New Testament was written appears to be a far more precise language than the English language. One is just kind of the way it's structured as a language, but also in their plurality of words. We normally illustrate that when we talk about love. Our English Bibles, except for the Old King James, that sometimes would use the word charity, we have that word in one, love. And they would have at least 4 different words for love. And we talk about how confusing, we take it for granted if you were not born speaking English, but born into an English speaking family and then learned English, they we just take for granted and we kind of distinguish. But it's really kind of weird the way we use words like that word love. We talk about, I can say I love baseball, I love fried chicken, I love my wife, and I love my mom. And to a foreigner, that may be just very, what? You feel the same way about fried chicken as you do your wife? And so, but they had 4 different words for that, and they had more than one word for poor or poverty. We just say poor. And there's a strange gamut of poverty, isn't there? But this word poverty, much like the word in the Beatitudes, poor in spirit, didn't mean the way we often use the word poor. And a lot of times when I talk about my childhood, I talk about us being poor growing up. Well, we had a house with electricity and running water, and we always had food on the table. But I can still say we were poor. Well, not in the sense that word poor in spirit. That word poor in spirit meant absolutely destitute. You had nothing and no prospects of anything. That you had no food and no money to buy food and no job to get money to buy food. And so when he says here deep poverty, it's probably, I don't know everybody's background, but it's probably a type of poverty that we've never experienced. Again, we talk about being poor and we're, maybe compared to some others, but this idea of in their deep poverty, they abounded in the riches of their liberality. So you see almost the contradictory words there, that their riches in the midst of their deep poverty. But we're going to see as we read on that that's not really a contradiction or a conflict. It's just saying uh, that though they were deeply impoverished, they still did what they could. I think of the woman that Jesus said she did, the lady that put in the 2 mites. And there's that idea of Jesus kind of saying in those almost contradictory words, she gave more than everybody else because she gave out of her poverty. So he is applauding these Macedonian churches that they gave. Now, we're going to see as we go through these two chapters, chapter 8 and 9, that what Paul here is referencing is kind of the secondary purpose on this missionary journey that he's on now. The primary purpose was to preach the gospel, but the secondary purpose was he was taking up a collection for the needy saints in Judea. And so he is doing two things. He's informing them of the need, and then he's collecting for that need. And to that end, the churches in Macedonia have given liberally, he says, even though they didn't have it to give, but they gave out of their poverty. For I bear witness, verse 3, that according to their ability, and we would pause here and say, we often make that comment when we talk, we make some preliminary comments or even prayers before our contribution, that's the way it is supposed to be, that it's based upon as we have been prospered, he said in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. And so here's, they did according to their ability. That's the way it's supposed to be. Now, we do not have, and I know you know this, but it doesn't hurt to repeat it, we don't have that mathematical percentage that the old covenant had, that tithe or that 1/10. We don't have that mathematical precision, but we do have something somewhat vaguely similar, that it is to be proportioned, isn't it? That it's supposed to be as we have prospered according to our ability. And so there's still some kind of unspoken, vague percentage there. Maybe percentage isn't the best word, but the idea that it's based upon how much we have. And so he says they did that. They did according to their ability. And in your mind there, just read as they've been prospered. Yes, and beyond their ability. And so they didn't just give as they had been prospered. If that had been the case, they'd have given this much. But he says they've given liberally out of their riches of their poverty. So he's saying they did more than that. They did what they had been prospered, but then they also went above and beyond and gave more than maybe would have been expected of them. He says they were freely willing, imploring us, verse 4. Not only did they give according to their ability, not only did they give more than they were able to give, he says they implored us with much urgency that we would receive the gift. And so, we didn't have to twist their arm. We didn't have to go back and, it's always that awkward thing, hey, you promised to give me something. When was I going to get that? It's always awkward to have to go back and ask, isn't it? But we didn't have to, they came to us. They were just begging us to give. And so we see that attitude in giving. And obviously, if this was a sermon, we talk about that should be our attitude in giving. Glenn?
He asked all the members to bring their tax returns so he could examine them to see if they were given what they should be given.
Yeah, how would that go over here? Yeah, yeah. And some I've heard, and this is all second and third hand of that situation where they basically will send a debt collector. In some denominations, we'll use that term, they ask for a commitment, like in January or maybe December for the next year. How much are you going to give? And if you don't do that, what you've promised to give, then they're going to come after you. And yeah, and so that just completely turns this around. But we see the two sides of this, that it's not that kind of, we're not that mercenary organization that we're just in it for the money and pressuring. And so the pressure should not come from the church or the leadership in the church, whatever that structure might be, but the pressure comes from the giver. And that's the way it ought to be. And so Paul says, I didn't have to twist their arms. I didn't even have to, they were begging me to take this. And you almost maybe, and I don't want to read too much into this, let me get over here in my opinion box, that almost get maybe the idea that Paul was saying, oh, y'all don't have to give that much. And they were just like, yes, we do. Almost that Paul was saying, look, I know how poor you are. Uh, you need some money to eat, so take some of this back. And they were just shoving it away. No, no, don't insult us. Take it. You almost get that at least that mentality, if that didn't literally happen. Imploring us with much urgency that we should receive the gift or the favor and the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. Maybe there's the key there in that word fellowship. The word fellowship can be translated communion, sharing, and so they had participation in that. And so that was the reason for their giving and giving beyond their ability and imploring us with great urgency is that they knew that this was a sharing in this. We've used the illustration of that idea of it's family. Uh, the money that you spend on family, and if you want to get depressed, if you've got children, Google how much it costs to raise a child from birth to college age. Depress yourself and Google that number, and you think if you look at that and you think, wow, that's a big number, and what human being out there would I give that much money to? Nobody. Nobody. But I would do that and most of us would see that number and say, well, didn't realize I had that much money, first of all. But you'd say, but I'd do it again. And so that's the idea of sharing. They saw this as this fellowship with these needy saints. It wasn't just some financial need that was out there. It wasn't just some charitable organization they were writing a check to. This were their brothers and sisters, and we're willing to share. And so that what causes you, go back to the book of Acts, to even sell possessions to help these people. If they need to eat, I'll sell my car so that you can eat because you're family. That's what we do for family, isn't it? Larry?
Fellowship has been used so much. Fellowship night, we all sit around and watch a movie and eat popcorn and we're having fellowship.
Yeah.
This is fellowship.
Yeah, the old joke and old preachers were known for corny jokes. They invented the dad joke thing, but the old joke was that those some churches when they hear the word fellowship they can almost smell the coffee and donuts. And that's really not the idea. The fellowship here is this sharing of a spiritual nature and the family aspect. And they did this, verse 5, 2 Corinthians 8, verse 5, they did this not as we had hoped, but first gave themselves to the Lord. And so this is kind of trampling on our sermon a little bit later this morning. But here, why? We asked the question, why or how? How could they have given so much when they were poor? Well, answer number one is that it was the fellowship, the ministering to the saints. We talked about that family aspect. Again, all of us would do that for family when we talked about them selling possessions. If you had two cars and your kids were starving, you'd sell one of those cars, wouldn't you? Or maybe both of those cars to get food for your babies. We wouldn't even think anything about that. And that's what they were doing. They were selling their possessions to give to their family. And because they had sharing and fellowship in that. So that's level number one. But now he gets and raises the bar even is that how could they do that? Well, they'd given themselves to the Lord. But this was something they weren't just doing to the church or for the church, and not just something doing for their brethren, but it was all based upon their relationship to God. When you give yourself to God. And so again, we could sermonize about that, whether it's talking about giving, whether it's talking about abstaining from worldly lust and sinful temptations, is that once you've made that big decision that I'm giving myself to the Lord, then that reframes every other small decision. Why do I do this? Why didn't I do that? Well, because I've given myself to the Lord. And so they'd first given themselves to the Lord, then to us by the will of God. I take that us to mean not just Paul and his traveling companions or Paul and the other apostles, but to the saints, as he'd said in verse 4. So we urge Titus that as he had begun, so he would also complete this grace in you as well. And so it seems that as we read along in this, that remember, let's remind ourselves, going the Wayback Machine, to 1 Corinthians chapter 16, he had given them the instructions. You do this on the first day of the week, lay by in store, and we can make a broad principle, don't misunderstand me, to our giving and how it is to be done and even when it is to be done. But Paul there was talking about a specific giving to these needy saints in Jerusalem. And so when you get together on the Lord's Day, you take up these collections then, so that when I come, and I think maybe I there would be whoever I send comes, that we don't have to wait. We don't have to go door to door, that you've already got that collected into what we would call into a common treasury. And so he gives them the instructions in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. And can we read between the lines? And again, we need to be careful when we do that with Scripture, that they hadn't done that yet. And so Paul is gently reminding them, and maybe a little bit of shaming them, that, look, they did it, and they're poor. Right? And maybe, and again, get my opinion box here, we're not sure, was he saying that the Macedonian saints were poor and the Corinthian saints weren't? Look, these poor people have already done this. In fact, they were begging us to take this money, and I'm hearing crickets from Corinth, and so there's a little bit of that in this. And so we urge Titus that he would complete this grace in you as well. But as you abound in everything, and we talked about this word before, that word abound literally means to throw beyond. And so here's the idea. We'll use this illustration that you're a football player and you're trying out for the team and you want to be the quarterback. And the coach says, you can be the quarterback if you can throw this football 50 yards. And so you wind up and back up and you throw it 100 yards. You went beyond what the goal was. That's what the word abound means. They abounded. So you have abounded in everything. You've abounded. You've gone above and beyond in faith. You've gone above and beyond in speech. You've gone above and beyond in knowledge. You've gone above and beyond in diligence. You've gone above and beyond in your love for us. But let's say you go above and beyond in this. And so, you're doing great in every other area, and so I'd hate to see you fail in this one. So go above and beyond in that. In other words, follow these Macedonians' examples. Now, verse 8, I speak not by commandment. And so a little pressure here applied, maybe a little shame. And he says, but not a commandment. And so this giving, again, is something that we're doing from the heart, out of our generosity. We go back again to the book of Acts, to the story of Ananias and Sapphira. Remember, they're lying about how much they had sold the land for and how much they had given. And Peter makes the comment in that, while he's pronouncing condemnation on them, he says, when you owned the land, wasn't it yours? And when you sold it, wasn't the money yours? In other words, you didn't have to bring this, and you didn't have to bring a certain amount. You had to bring all of it. It was the lying that was the problem. This was yours. And so this was a voluntary expedition. So I speak not way of command, but I'm testing the sincerity of your love by the diligence of others. Now, if we're just honest about this, it's one of those where Paul says, I'm not speaking by demand, but by command. I'm not demanding you do this, but he's still applying some pressure. It's like a mother on Mother's Day, saying, you didn't have to give me a gift, but if you loved me, if you knew what all I've done, and I go, well, I don't have to, but I kind of have to, don't I? And so I would see it this way. It's not a commandment, but it's the way to show your love. And so it's not, as strangely as it sounds, I would word it this way. Paul's saying this giving isn't a commandment, but it's a necessity. I'm not commanding, but love is a necessity. And if you're going to show the sincerity of your love, then you would do this. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so he's used the poor Macedonians as an example. And now he's going to up the ante and say, let's look at another example, Jesus Christ. Though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor. And so giving, and what's the argument against giving? Argument against giving is, if I give it, then I won't have it anymore. I'm rich, define rich however you want to, but if I give, I'll be less rich or I'll be poor. Well, Jesus did that, didn't he? He was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that you, through his poverty, that is, his becoming poor, impoverished, that you might become rich. And so Jesus gave abundantly so that you would have something that you didn't have. And that's kind of what we're asking you to do for these needy saints. And in this, I give my advice. So again, not a commandment, but advice. It's your to advantage. It's to your advantage not only to be doing what you began and were desiring to do a year ago. So again, Paul had issued in 1 Corinthians 16 the order and how this was to be done. It seems they had communicated to Paul, we're on board, we'll do that. And now Paul is just kind of reminding them gently, maybe not so gently, nudging them to fulfill their commitment. But now, verse 11, you must also complete the doing of it. And so good intentions and good commitment means nothing unless you follow through. That as there was a readiness to desire it, there must also be a completion out of what you have. And so here is the real rub. And I think we've all been in this situation, whether it's finance or something else. You know, you ask me if I want to help you do something in May, you'll get a hearty, oh, yes, today. But the closer we get to May, and I see that on my calendar, I wish I hadn't have told them I was going to do that. I don't want to. And, you know, there's always a little bit of that. It's easy to say, help you do that. And then when it gets closer to time, like, and that's kind of what's going on here. It's easy to say, yeah, the needy saints, well, absolutely we'll help them. We'll give. But that's the easy part, is to say, yeah, we'll do that. Paul says now, how about that there be a completion of what you have committed to? For if there is first, verse 12, if there's first a willing mind, it is accepted according to what one has and not according to what he doesn't have. And so you didn't make a commitment of something that you couldn't do, that you didn't have. You made a commitment out of what you have. For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened. You're not the only people that are doing this. You know, I'm just asking you to completely fulfill the needs of those needy saints. And again, maybe the subtle hint is referencing back to the Macedonian brethren who have already done this. For I do not mean that others be eased and you be burdened, verse 14, but by an equality, that now at this time your abundance may supply their lack. And so again, am I right in kind of reading between the lines that unlike the Macedonian brethren, these Corinthians weren't poor? He says they gave, they gave their butter and egg money to these needy saints. I'm asking you to just give what the money you got laying around, your abundance. So again, maybe can read too much into that, but it seems to me that's in fact, think of it this way. He's saying you give out of your abundance. Is that what he said about the Macedonians, that they gave out of their abundance? No, they gave out of their poverty. I'm asking you, in other words, I'm not asking you to do something that I haven't asked anybody else, and certainly the Macedonians to do, but that your abundance may supply their lack. We know from connecting all the dots in Acts and Paul's epistles were those needy saints in Jerusalem and Judea, that their abundance also may supply your lack, that there may be equality. Now, a couple of things about this. what's he saying? First of all, just in this particular instance, what are they? Is he saying that down the road the roles might be reversed? That you might be impoverished and they'll be doing okay, and that they can do that? That's possible the case. But what Paul will say, book of Romans and other places where Paul references this idea, is that he's saying that this exchange, if we can call it that, doesn't have to be, we would say, in kind. It doesn't have to be you give them money, they'll give you money. In fact, his argument in other places is that they've already given to you. Those are the ones who sent me to preach the gospel to you. And so they've given to you spiritually. And so you need to give to them physically. And maybe that's going to keep going on, he's saying. And so it's not, I don't think it's an apples for apples exchange here. You give them money because they have given you money or will later give you money. They're supplying to you spiritually, and so you need to supply to them physically. He'll make the same arguments about the support of the preaching of the gospel. They've given to you spiritually, and so you need to give back to them. It doesn't have to be, well, okay, I'll preach to him every other Sunday. No, there's a different type of exchange. Nick?
Sure, the exact timing of this, that, you know, when Paul had to go to Jerusalem and that meeting about, well, do we keep parts of the old law or not? And they would, if they had decided, yeah, we'll keep circumcision and things like that, they would have pushed that onto these Gentiles. And the Christians in Jerusalem chose correctly, you know,
Yeah.
as the Lord would have them to do, but that was a gift to the rest of the world, that you don't have to keep the things that the Jews do and us be able to lord it over you from Jerusalem. You're free, you know, as Gentiles. And that was, in a way, a gift to them.
And so the good point. The us and them is not just geography. We're in Corinth, they're in Judea. It may be this ethnic racial difference. They're Jews, you're Gentiles. And hey, Gentiles, if it wasn't for the Jews, you know, there wouldn't be no preaching of the gospel. They started this. I think we understand it. Like you said, accommodative. They didn't really start it. God did, but they did. They participated in that. So yeah, good point. That there may be equality. Now, the next step, and this argument is sometimes seen, like even the book of Acts, where it says they had all things in common. And if you wanted to push an agenda, you could see God's in favor of communism. Well, a couple, no more than a couple, big problems with that. Forget the oppression and all the other stuff that comes with communism, but just look at the financial thing is that this isn't the promoting of communism. One thing about communism does, in theory at least, seek to have this equality, but it does so forcefully and by rigging the system. And so he's not saying that. He's saying there needs to be some equality. And I don't think anybody would argue that by equality that you have to ask these Jews in Jerusalem, how much money do you have in your bank account? I've got mine, and so I'll give you, so that we're exactly. He's not saying that. He's saying the idea of sharing. But the difference here is that this is voluntary. It's not forced to, even by God. He's saying it's not a commandment, I'm giving my advice, but there needs to be some equality. And again, don't think equality in that sense that we have to, you know, as Glenn was talking about, we have to every Sunday bring our tax forms, our bank statements, and say, oh, you made this much this week, I made this much here. Now we're exactly even. And next week we'll compare. We understand that's not what he's talking about with equality. He's talking about the idea of sharing. I have something you don't. Equality means I'm going to empty my cupboard or share in my cupboard so that you've got something to eat. The equality might be that I give you a little bit of what I have out of my abundance, but also may mean that if you're deeply impoverished, I'm going to give you more. Now my bank account's empty because you are really in need. And so it's this idea of equality that needs to be understood in its context. As it is written, he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. So there's the idea of equality. We see someone, particularly here, a brother or sister in Christ in need, then we're going to supply to that need. Now, in a little bit of time, we're going to draw a line there because it starts really in another paragraph there in verse 16. Let's talk about this idea of what we're to be doing in supplying these needs, and there being equality. That it's obvious in the New Testament that there's preferential treatment here. And here's what I mean by preferential treatment. That and we emphasize this sometimes in the idea of authority, that he's talking about the needy saints in Jerusalem. Were there other people in Jerusalem and Judea, non-Christians, who were in need, who were starving and hardship? Absolutely. We can't assume that it was just, I think maybe Christians had it a little bit harder because of persecution and different things. But he's saying is you are helping the saints. He's already used that word there. Now, a couple things about that. We understand the difference between my treasury, my bank account, and the churches. There's difference. The individual can do things that the collective does not have the authority to do. And so there's that. But also, we make no apologies in showing preference to family over others. If my children are hungry and the guy across the street is hungry and I have one potato, guess who's getting that potato? My kids are. Now, if I have enough potatoes, my kids will get it first and then you can have some. But we make no apologies about that. Now, don't take that to extreme. Well, I'll help my own and they could starve. No. But there is preference. Preference doesn't mean exclusion. It just means if I only have one, then it's going to we make no apologies for that. And we make no apologies for that about spiritual family. I make no apologies that I love you more than I love the people of the world. Now, again, I don't take that to, I hate them, I'm going to mistreat them. No, but I prefer you to them. And again, we make no apologies for that. And again, hopefully I don't have to say it, put the asterisk there. That doesn't mean, but just like with our physical families, we see that preferential treatment here, that he's saying, look, you've got brothers and sisters in Christ who are destitute. Help them. Nothing is said about the other people because there's family. There's always preferential treatment to family. And we don't need, I would argue, and I'm not even talking about necessarily what we do from the church treasury. I'm talking about individually. If there's a brother and sister in need, and there's other people who are in need, I'm going to see to their needs first. Then, if I can, I'll help the others. But family comes first. That's a biblical principle, whether we're talking about our physical, earthly families or our spiritual families. Again, I don't want to be misunderstood. That doesn't mean we don't care for others. We do. But there has to be a pecking order there, absolutely, in that, and we make no apologies for that. So, all right, we'll pick up still on that vein of the collection for these needy saints. In fact, we're going to get some more details here as we pick up in chapter 8, verse 16.